Hello.
Yeah,
I
we'll
just
start.
woke up.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for. Hello? Oh, this one not working? Hello? Yeah, okay, good. Um, so with Mass Effect, like to me, it like without getting too much into it right away, it reminds me of, I didn't. Some people would say, "Oh, you're not legit because you didn't play it in March 2012 and all that other stuff when the backlash started and all that thing." Because this is mostly about three and the ending, but I enjoyed the whole series. I think what kept me away from it, even though I kind of wanted to play it earlier, if I had known, if I had known what they did with the second game, already kind of transitioned and into a more of a like cover-based shooter to the game's detriment, in my opinion, because it made it very easy, even on the hardest difficulty level, because they didn't implement the segmented shielding until the third game, so you really didn't have to be careful whatsoever in that game at all. And that's just the gameplay criticism, but it felt like a very middling chapter, not like a lot of necessarily storyline revelations. But I don't think Cerberus started to piss anybody off until the third game because they didn't like really what. I don't know if they were trying to make them sound sympathetic, but after the first game, which they weren't sympathetic at all, I don't know, because it was still Drew. I don't know how to say his last name. It's like Happy or something like that. He was still writing it, so I don't know how many writers Mass Effect had, but it was most likely his decision to do something different with Cerberus, and maybe that was their attempt to be like, oh, let's look at it from a different angle. But
Yeah, Drew Karpyshyn has a history of trying to do sort of like both sides in games writing, which is interesting. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it it's a little like he's the one who wrote the Sith Code, right? After doing the KOTOR games and started like a Sith fandom. He wrote the book Darth Bane, which is interesting because you want to ask yourself, if the Sith really existed, why would someone want to join the Sith, right? At the same time, they are bad guys. They've murdered, hundreds of thousands of people, and so it's a little bit creepy to like see people actually saying, "Oh, this makes sense to me. I would join this organization." Same with Cerberus. Like, Jacob is working for a terrorist organization, yet he's presented as this, nice guy, and it's not really questioned. And I think that's actually a worthwhile question to ask because I think there are people. There's arguments to be made that in real life, decent people work for organizations that other people would say are like fundamentally corrupt. But it was this like weird disconnect because in Mass Effect 1, Cerberus was like unequivocally an evil terrorist organization, and then we transitioned to, oh, both sides have a point. You can work for Cerberus and still be a good person. There's different parts of Cerberus, and it's yeah.
um, I don't know if Martin Sheen, I recognized his voice right away, and I especially liked how my mother was in the other room, and like, that voice sounds familiar, and because we had just seen like Apocalypse World War II, so he did some great narration for that series. But I think it might have been by the third. He doesn't have as much of a role in the third game, but so I'm guessing he said it on the second one. But he's like, he enjoyed the role, but he considered it to be like a despicable character. I don't know the exact quote.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he's kind of like the suave Rico Suave, like the cigarette smoking man, I think of also, even though that's not a great analogy, but because I haven't even seen the X-Files, I'm just familiar with him. And
Oh, I have a whole fanfic idea about how Elusive Man is just the president from the West Wing who somehow survived
yeah, that's
into
a
the
fun
future.
connection too.
But yeah, it makes sense because he was a decent guy as long as there were only human beings. Turns out he's racist against everyone who's not a human being, right? And maybe we'd all be racists if there were aliens. Who knows? But
Yeah, I forget what's the name of the organization in the first game because I thought it was mostly an aside. You make one of those vaunted choices that were supposed to get so much to the ending, and we'll get into that. But I just kind of slapped them and said, no, that's stupid. You got to especially since it's only been about 30 years by the first game, I think, and not thousands and thousands of years. And have fun with it, but Mass Effect is even more inconsistent when it comes to age than like Dune is. Good luck trying to figure out when anything happens or who lives the longest. And initially you think it's only the see like I'm so I guess I was so waiting for the third game, and the great, like, huge disappointment that I almost, and that's what I kind of tried to say about the second game earlier, that it kind of felt very middling to me, and not in a good way, like Empire Strikes Back or something like that, but um, it was what are the names of the races again? I don't know why they're not coming to mind. the Asari, they get, and then they say, okay, they're definitely, they turn out to be jerks in the third game also, and I'm not really surprised, but they kind of drop hints, various, that the Krogan also lived thousands of years, and the Turian, no, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, the Solarians live very long, but the Turians are always kind of up in the air, at least from what I remember. I read most of the journals, but I don't think they ever fully commit to the average lifespan for them, as opposed to the Vorcha. Yeah, they only live like 20 years or something like that, but it seems like they wanted to emphasize the dichotomy between like the Asari and the Solarians, but then it got all over the place to the point of when they got to the Leviathans in the third game and that were dropped in the first game, it just seemed to be like wisdom equals age. They're old, even though we'll get more into the Leviathans. The Leviathans are incredibly aloof species,
Yeah.
There's
a whole thing that you could do about how
more about inconsistencies than anything. I'm saying.
There's a whole thing you could do about how in science fiction humans seem to always be the shortest lived race, and everyone else lives like 300 or 400 years, because it makes it convenient for the writer, so that they can have characters stick around longer. But it's a weird. I once said that the relationship between Vulcans and humans in Star Trek is like humans and cats. Vulcans just don't hold humans to very high standards because they die in like 20 years and they're stupid, and you can pinch them on the back of the neck to make them hold still, so I'm sorry, I'm not being very serious today, but the Mass Effect 3 ending actually interested me because I think it's this whole difficult problem of how do you wrap up a story that you designed to make as complicated and ambiguous as possible, right? And how do you have an ending where you make a choice, that actually feels meaningful when you're trying to also make all your past choices feel meaningful? And they punted on that. Like it wasn't a good ending. I don't think anyone thinks it was, but I would just point out, like, it's the same kind of thing they did with Deus Ex. In fact, it's the same 3 endings as Deus Ex, right? There's the ending where you keep things the same, the ending where you blow everything up, and the ending where you have the magical transformative singularity, and I just find it. I just was frustrated that the discussion over the Mass Effect 3 ending started like conflating all these different things. I think the way the ending was written was bad. I don't think a better ending would have been an unambiguous victory, right? And I had disagreed with a lot of people about that. Like, I think it's good that you can't have an ending where Shepard wins and kills the Reapers and there's no sacrifice, right? And that's what some people seem to want. And I'm like, no, it's good that we can't have that ending. It's not good that we had this very abrupt, Deus Ex Machina kind of ending where you pick 3 things that have nothing to do with the choices that you made earlier. I also think that you can say the ending was bad and say, like, it's a bad thing for creators to go back and edit their work based on what fans think, even if the criticism is a valid criticism, because I think that's a bad precedent, I feel like there needs to be a kind of like line between saying I don't like something and saying I have the right to make you change it, because then someone else who has a bad opinion could make them change it based on majority rule. I think there needs to be like room for creators to screw up, but still say we have to respect what they do as a creator. So I'm not really into the trend of like petitions to like rewrite a game the way you wanted it to be written, even if I agree with what the petition says.
It could have been in the zone. Again, maybe I would have been able to appreciate it more, but I also kind of tried to reject that, like, hell, creationists use that argument, were you there, and to try and, I don't know what they're doing in their sophistry and stuff like that. But back to Mass Effect, see, this is my fault. But when he said about, like, I don't know if I'll be able to get back to it, kind of like, I think people briefly flirted with the idea of dark energy being responsible and what they did, and then people have commented on it like that, not just Drew, because he did talk about it, but they don't understand what dark energy is, and his exact quote is, you can have some fun with it, like Element Zero, and alter it in a few moments, but it's supposed to be mostly realistic. And his quote was, I find it funny that fans end up hearing a couple things they like, and in their minds they add all the details they specifically want. It's like vaporware. Vaporware is always perfect. Anytime somebody talks about the new greatest game, it's perfect until it comes out. I'm a little wary about going into too much detail, because whatever we came up with, it probably wouldn't have been what people wanted it to be. And it really didn't elaborate more than that, but as far as I know, they were trying to imply that the Reapers were trying to get in the way of entropy, essentially, which I guess that's not precisely what dark energy is, but
Yeah, does anyone know the how they sort of changed the? Are you all familiar with how they changed the backstory for the Reapers from Mass Effect 1 to what it eventually became? The original idea, I think, was actually possibly more interesting, which is that
tell
the
me, please.
Reapers were natives of deep space. They lived outside the galaxy, and they see people using the Mass Effect, the titular Mass Effect, Element Zero, and dark energy as
Oh yeah, that
pollution,
part too. They use
as
it, yeah.
pollution, right? That people who are flying through through space at faster than light speeds are damaging their world. They live in space, and we're like screwing it up by moving through it. So they destroy civilizations that become spacefaring civilizations, and that to me is interesting because it's like. That's one of those morally ambiguous situations, right? They were there first, right? And we are messing up their world by doing what we do, and they have a right to defend themselves, you know. But they eventually dropped that because they got pulled into the like AI versus biological life forms argument and made the Reapers into that, which I'm not saying is bad, but I feel like was a little bit forced.
Yeah.
And if you can tell, I think, that if you play Mass Effect 1, Sovereign doesn't come off like the kind of person, the kind of motivation that you get when you get the eventual explanation of what the Reapers are. Like, he treats you like you don't matter, right? Whereas, like, you're just an obstacle to whatever it is he wants to do. Whereas later on, it's like, oh, the point of the Reapers is to, like, preserve life, and you matter a lot, which is why we're making a human Reaper, you know.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a contradiction.
It feels very middling, but there was one part I remember now when the AI thing, even though they kind of touch upon it in the early discussions about the Geth in the first game, but aside from them being the zombies or the Frankenstein monsters in the first game, they're just in the way. You don't really necessarily get much insight. You do in the second game with Legion, and that's a good moment in the second game. They kind of screw it up in the third one, but it does. I think that's probably the best part of the second game. You know, I didn't like the Human Reaper wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what I expected it to be.
Yeah. No, I will give them props for the Geth Aquarian storyline in Mass Effect is one of the best examples I can think of a morally ambiguous, where you can, if you work at it, sympathize with both sides, and you can see, like, I'm taking a side, like I'm on the side of the Geth, right, because I'm an AI rights person. Not that that's relevant in the real world right now, but you can empathize with like how we got to this point, right, and with how the Quarians will never forgive the Geth, you know, or like it's almost impossible for them to do so, even though it's arguably their fault. And a lot of wars and a lot of conflicts in real life, you know, you can trace back to like it's just an argument over who was screwed worse, but both sides were screwed by historical atrocities.
Yeah. The choice is easy for me because I want a 9-foot-tall, whatever they're called, that Legion eventually downloads himself into and talks like this, except even deeper. So that's an easy choice, just to put a little levity in that. We're trying to be a little bit funny, also.
But yeah, I did find.
But you
like,
can do both. It's true.
I did find that, you know, I also liked the wrinkle in Mass Effect where they showed that what looks like a two-side conflict is actually more complicated than that. And you learn that in the history of the Quarian Geth War, originally there were a lot of Quarians who were sympathetic to the Geth. Guess what? After the Quarian homeworld was destroyed, the only ones who survived were the hardline militarists, right? You find out that the hostile Geth were originally the Geth heretics, and oh my gosh, there's actually like millions more Geth who could have taken over the galaxy a long time ago but chose not to, you know, and all of that is cool, and I always like when people deepen the stories like that. That in real life, even when there's very, very entrenched ethnic conflicts, often the reason they're so entrenched is that the people who were the angriest about the conflict survived the longest, and the people who are in the middle of the road, for better or for worse, their stories get ignored, and they're often the first ones to get purged when, you know, violence breaks out.
It is nuanced, yeah, you know, but if I may, the ending is what I had the most on, specifically, you know, like, I don't think Mass Effect ever claimed to be like an original property, like it's going to offer some bold, new, incredible vision into science fiction, you know, working from, I haven't played Knights of the Old Republic yet, but I think people at least knew what to expect of the gameplay with some modifications. But the thing that especially, I don't know if it surfaced immediately after, like it was like 2 months or so before the DLC came out from the original ending, but the weirdest thing that people ended up doing, again, human reaper. I heard that phrase, on a random message board, and I didn't realize that, because I happen to think the final boss of Mass Effect 2 looks more like a Terminator, not so much a human. And it's not a human. Well, it's a human in per se, but when they're shoving it down your throats in the third game, that random kid you keep seeing, even though you see him killed, I thought, like, oh boy, that's like a pretender from Transformers. Like, is he going to end up? And God damn it, I was right. Even though it's only a representation of him, but I guess Shepard's particular, it's like the subconscious decides to assign himself to seeing that kid die or something like that, because those scenes where you're running and you keep chasing him for a while, and then he either decides to manifest himself as that, because when you do hear the Reaper AI, and I'm going to call it Reaper AI because people briefly called it Star Child, and I have no idea why. It is not a celestial being. It is not a divine being. It's nothing like that.
It's the Catalyst. That's the name, right?
Oh,
so
is that what it officially calls it? Yeah, it does.
It is. It's the Catalyst.
But that's what it was after they changed that, and then I saw that's when you hear what its voice actually sounds like. If you decide not to, but that's only in the modified DSN, and it's like, so be it, and like it's obviously meant to be a projection of what it really is in the form of the child.
Fun fact is that when it talks, you hear echoes of its voice.
Yeah,
and those
that's
voices,
cool too. Yeah.
Those voices are Jennifer Hale and the dude who voices Manship, because I don't play Manship. So
it's like Mark Meir or something.
But yeah. So it's the one time you hear the other Shepard's voice if you're playing.
Oh,
whatever.
Percentages. What was that? I did it just to be contrarian. Female Shepherd. Male Shepherds? Female Shepherds?
Yeah.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
yeah. It's Jennifer Hale.
Was she well known back then? Like
yeah.
2007
yeah.
or so? But
yeah,
okay. I would think
she
so,
was
but
Bastila, man.
Okay.
I
mean, I do know some video game voice actors. They very much contrast, like Steve Bloom, between anime and it's different type of work, and so I don't know, but that's cool that it was well known already. Go ahead.
I think this is to get a little bit into like real life politics a bit, but I'm fascinated by FemShep because it's the same story as Ripley in Alien, where a lot of people latched on to this, quote unquote, strong female character, and the question is like why, and why do people think so many previous female characters are pandering or not very good? And the reason is she wasn't written as a female character, right? One of the things they did in the script in Alien was we call her Ripley instead of Ellen Ripley because originally they were just last names, and they cast blind based on race and gender. They just like whoever's best for this role, regardless of who they are. And then later we'll play with, who's a woman, who's a man, etc. But Ripley was originally just Ripley. And so the character was written to do everything a guy would do in the story, and then you had a woman playing her. And all of a sudden all these female fans were like, oh my God, a woman who's not doing the women things, right? The women tropes, who's not crying, who doesn't need to be rescued, who does all the cool badass stuff a guy would do. And then she becomes, a female role model. And the same thing was like, it felt almost like, in fact, you can actually, there's like people joking, you can tell that they started with the male shepherd model and then they just replaced it with the female shepherd model. There's places where if you make her wear a dress, she'll like sit with her legs apart like this. The shepherd wearing dress fail. It's on YouTube. But it's like, yeah, they started off with the idea of a male character and then they just had a female character do what the male character would do. And then later on, obviously, they added storylines, romances, etc., based on the gender of the character you played, but you got to play a character who would do all the cool stuff you expect from a video game protagonist without someone putting in like, oh, this is what makes her a woman. And a lot of people gravitated to that, and it was really cool. And it's like, I'm not saying in fact, it sucks that that's the way you have to do it. It sucks that we are sort of in a situation where you can't start off writing a female character without someone saying, okay, well, then what's the angle for making her female? Why did you make her female? And like putting stuff in there to justify her being female. You shouldn't have to do that, right? It shouldn't have to be that way. But right now, that is a way that you get badass female characters, is that you start off without thinking, it's a guy, and then let's change as little as we need to change in order to make it a girl. And that's part of what I think made FemShep really cool. And I would like to see in the future, more diversity in characters so that we don't have to have like, if you want to play a cool woman in a game, play a game where the protagonist could be either one and you pick, right? But that is a complaint that I've heard. I don't know. I love Rhianna Pratchett's work on Tomb Raider, but at the same time, people were like, oh, they wanted to make Lara Croft more realistic, so they made her cry. Right? They made her scared and weak and afraid. I'm like, well, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it is true that a lot of people have gotten mad that when it's specifically when it's a woman character, the way to make that character deeper is to make them have a breakdown, is to show them weak and vulnerable, and that we don't, no one says like Nathan Drake in Uncharted has to like cry in order for you to think he's a real person. But like Metroid Other M, look at the backlash for that. Like Samus was awesome because Samus started out as a character you thought was a guy, and it turns out Samus is a girl, and it doesn't matter, right? But then in Other M, it's like, how do we make Samus feel like a real character? Let's make her cry. Let's make her like terrified of Ridley, even though she's beaten Ridley over and over again in so many games. But let's have her like have a nervous breakdown before she fights Ridley. And it's like, the intentions weren't necessarily bad, but when you add it up, when you look at the number of times this is what we do to a woman specifically to make it feel real, that rubs people the wrong way. I think that's just a justifiable thing.
To me, it was a gameplay thing because like Yahtzee said, he called his character Titty Shepherd and made him look like Peter Paul Swayze, who's kind of like Edward James almost, except probably not as familiar, facial scars, just to kind of juxtapose it with everybody throwing himself at him. And I kind of messed around with it, kind of like when you do in created characters in wrestling games. You have to have fun with it, and then they standardized it in the second game. I don't know if I did something wrong, but they gave us the generic female shepherd. I could have altered parameters, but I guess I just wanted to get on with the game. But I wasn't able to. I guess after the surgery, that's what they kind of. I don't know if I was able, if it was an option to actually reproduce the face perfectly, but I didn't care. And I kind of liked it, but by the second game, and especially the third one, I started caring more about the outfits, like, especially in playing Mass Effect 3 more than 1, altering the colors, so how the character looked almost didn't matter too much to me again. But what I did want to say about the Star Child is it actually reminds me of Corellian, before people realized it, from Xenogears, like how he famously says, maybe people were looking for justification for their anger, like, oh, this is getting into a religious connotation, therefore this is why the ending sucks, and they're doing it 180, even though there was no evidence that he was a divine being, the catalyst. Krellian says, if God doesn't exist, I will make one with my own hands in that game. And is it like a self-satisfaction, your desire to do something for humanity? But ultimately, I found out, and I was glad to read this, because I thought I had known Voltaire pretty well, but it refers to one of his papers, I guess, as a criticism against the three imposters, which is meant to be a dietetic, or almost a philippic against the three main religious leaders, Muhammad, Moses, and Jesus. And he said one of his best-known quotations in that, he goes, if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him, when he's arguing for the moral strength that religion provides in society. And I was glad to be reminded of that. Then, of course, the anarchist philosopher tried to counter that. I believe his name is pronounced Bakunin. He said, which, if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to abolish him. And I don't know if that's something in the minds of the fans, like a collective mentality, like, ooh, if we assign that, therefore we can tear down the ending more. And then they clarified it. He's just a Reaper AI. But
do you know Film Crit Hulk? He's awesome.
I think so.
His shtick is that he writes film reviews as the Hulk. So they're in all caps.
Oh, boy.
They're very intelligent film reviews, but they're in all caps, and he says Hulk instead of I. That's it. But
I love Credible Hulk, that recent, that's great,
But he wrote a thing about the way geeks review movies, and I say this like as a geek who does this. He's like, the reason that people poke holes in the plot, and that we do a lot of like carping about the world building, is because we don't have the language to otherwise say why the movie isn't good. The purpose of making a movie or a game is to suck you in, because the idea behind the story is always stupid. It's always an excuse to have a plot, right? Like, superheroes don't make sense. Science fiction ultimately always involves like fudging huge swaths of like how science actually works in order to let you have an adventure, right? But if the story is good, you are willing to go along with that. You are willing to fill in the gaps in logic yourself in your mind. If the story is bad, you're not willing to do that, and you start noticing all the holes, right? It's like every stage show is just people in a costume standing on stage pretending to be people that they aren't. If they're good actors, you forget that, and you can imagine that you're really in that place. If not, you start looking at, like, this is ridiculous. This is a guy pretending to be shot, and he was actually, just clutching his chest, right? but it's not the fault of the plot per se, it's the fault of the execution. So I don't think that I feel like there were so many arguments about the Mass Effect 3 ending about like, you know, whether the ending made sense within the context of the game's world. And I feel like it's really more that it didn't make sense within the context of the way the game was set up. Yeah, sure, the Star Child could make sense, right? There's a mechanism for how he can do the things he does, but it feels like a Deus Ex Machina. We've never been told before that there's a remote control by which you could like turn off all the Reapers at once, right? We've never been told before that there was, beyond that there's a remote control you could use the master relays to turn everyone into a human synthetic hybrid, whatever the hell that means, right? This is all thrown at you at the last minute. It feels like control is being taken away from you.
It might be because I wasn't invested, you know, playing them one after another. I didn't have that requisite time. It's a problem also in the Phoenix Wright series because it's hard to play those types of games one after another. They're as good as they are, but the point being...
I mean, I actually had an argument with my wife about this because I thought it was really clear that Control was not supposed to be one of the good endings and that you were supposed to like pick, destroy, or synthesis. And then she was like, no, Control is the best ending because it's the one that actually integrates all the stuff from the plot from before. And you know, she's a much bigger Mass Effect fan than me, and she was like, for me, playing Shepard meant putting together everyone to have a role in saving the world. You know, like the plot of Mass Effect 3 is bringing together all the disparate races that hate each other and bringing them together. And she was like, for me, the best possible ending was one where even Elusive Man, who's the bad guy, even he had a role to play. His idea was a good idea, and he just wasn't the person to do it. But she was like, the Control ending actually is the best ending because you're not violating everybody's consent and turning them into something against their will. You're not killing the Reapers, you're just turning them to a better purpose. And it's like, and Shepard is the one to do it, and Elusive Man wasn't, but he contributed even at the very end. And I was like, well, that's cool. That is actually kind of cool, even though I hate that guy, right? I don't want him to have been right about anything, but that's a cool option to give, you know?
Benefit of the doubt. I view ultimately, again, I could be too close, so I can't reconcile the feelings. Emotion is powerful. You know, we're all sophists in our own way without necessarily being, you know, we'll look for the holes, even if it is specious or it might not make sense logically. But Shepard was a mover and a shaker to me, not an individual. Like, he felt like the character was meant to move to a grand decision, be it through curing the genophage or... Apparently, you can alter I forgot how to do it, the survivor on a Kuz bit, you can be something else. They aren't the player. They are inherently special. Perhaps no event shows this better than 2184 Destapona, in which you are tracking the Leviathans, and you uncover a brief but quite tragic tale of a ship brought down by a Leviathan pulse, and whose crew ultimately went crazy amid resorting to cannibalism. It's well described, but they were just people. Shepard is not, be it through his acknowledgement by the Leviathans or the events of the storyline, which always made me feel like I was going for a greater purpose and like I was at the strings of a puppeteer. The cyclical nature of the plot, it felt like a grand decision to address a problem, not so much save the galaxy and Legion the Geth, Tali, all that stuff. It was built into it. And I cared about them far more than the Reaper conflict. But they're meant to be the person, but like he said with his wife about the Control ending, this is how I see it. I'm secretly hoping, especially after Andromeda was released, that we'll get some kind of extra-galactic threat like the Yuzong Vog in Star Wars or Daniel and Marty in Dune.
You like the Yuzong Vong in Star Wars?
They're from another galaxy, even though they've been
but
written
they
out.
were terrible. No, forget it.
I'm just trying to have fun with it, you know? Andromeda has nowhere to go with it.
Okay.
Does anybody, you know who Daniel and Marty is? Anybody familiar with Dune? Because we'll get into that in a second, but think of it as having Reapers and their Shepard, I get it, to control it around should make such a possibility of an invasion. You know, like, as Futurama put it, nothing can stop a monster that big, nothing except an even equally big monster. So, like, a huge fleet of Reapers could possibly, depends what they want to do with the writing, but at least opens it up, and that's why I feel Control is legitimate. And here it is, literally. Tell me if this sounds familiar, because some people will, not necessarily intentionally, overrate the storyline of Mass Effect, like that's deeply profound or that's never been anywhere else. Transports every enemy of the enemy computer network into another dimension forever. Blank 1 offers Blank 2 the choice between continuing their war or ending it. Blank 1, I'm trying my best not to spoil it, so in case you haven't read it, you don't know which characters I'm referring to. Blank 1 chooses peace over victory, and they and Blank 2 merge minds. Blank 1 imparts Blank 2 with all the codes required to run the machine civilization, as well as all of Blank 1's knowledge, setting Blank 2 as the bridge between humans and machines and to permanently end the divide and ensure that the two may coexist. With little left for them, Blank 1 expresses a desire to learn everything possible about humans and asks Blank 2 to deactivate him so that he may experience death. As you can see, this is hardly a theme unique to Mass Effect. Pretty on the nose, wouldn't you say? Not perfect, but it's clearly inspired by it. And you might say, oh no, this is Brian Herbert or someone else, but he's working from his father's notes, and I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. And as Arthur C. Clarke said about Dune and its related stories, Charles Dunbar is not the biggest fan of it. He feels that nothing compares to Dune except maybe Lord of the Rings, so it's considered pretty darn high-quality stuff. And I'm sure the Mass Effect writers were at least inspired by it. And it's not, to me, it's not lazy writing as it relates to Mass Effect. It has quite a humanist message. And I wonder if it was the sense of entitlement, either indirect or unintentional, that the Mass Effect boycott involves. If you're familiar with Free the anime, I watched it specifically because a bunch of people tried to tell the developers what kinds of anime they can make. That's ridiculous. You know what I'm referring to with that? It's basically a show that was more geared to, we won't get into it, but petulance, entitlement, maybe confused with what it means to be an extreme fan.
Well, yeah.
When you get to the potential to try and tell others what to do, like you said, that's where they draw the line. Like I have to do with my students.
So hi, I'm Arthur Chu. If you know what I've written about, I've got a history with angry fans in fandom. I think this is one of those things where I respect passion. I'm a passionate fan, but yeah, I do think there's a line between being passionate about something and acting like you own that thing, which is a detriment both to the actual person who does own that thing, the creator, and to everyone else who likes it and might like it for different reasons than you do. But I feel like this is something that it's certainly a problem in other fields. Yeah, were you going to?
Sorry, yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or at least they try to, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not a huge. I don't have huge respect for canon, right? Because canon usually just means the person who originally created it left, and in the comic book world we're used to this, and then a bunch of suits figured out how they can make more money off of it. So I don't respect canon in that sense. I do feel like there's a sense in which, in particular in gaming, because we identify so much more with a character in gaming, because you're actually experiencing it, you're playing it. People get, they sort of slip past that emotional line more than with movies or TV. And the Mass Effect petition, which I thought was ridiculous. The worst one was the one that you sent to the FTC, to the Federal Trade Commission, and said we want our money back because this was false advertising. And they actually said, you promised that we would feel control and have the power to affect the ending, and I don't feel like we could affect the ending at all. And like that's like saying like a movie said the movie would be good and it wasn't good, so therefore I get my money back, right? Like it's a subjective artistic thing. Where do you draw the line with it? But I understand that you do feel like a lot more like you personally feel cheated when a game has a bad ending because you worked to get there, or you feel like you worked to get there. And was a movie.
You go about it the wrong way, though.
Right. With a movie, you feel like, oh, I just sat here for 2 hours and I didn't see something I liked. But it's not like I, as Shepard, was robbed of victory. And that's something that I think is tough because I do feel like for games to be art, the creator has to have the ability to possibly make you feel bad, right? For the range of emotions that you experience to include negative ones, to be frustrated, but that's dangerous because you're playing with fire when you do that, right? But so I don't know where I stand. Well, I'll say where I stand. I didn't like the Mass Effect ending, and I thought people should have been more chill about it, right? But but yeah, I am in favor of stuff like Spec Ops: The Line that was like, we're going to see if we can make you feel like crap for playing a video game, right? We're going to see if we can, make you feel what it's like to be frustrated and disappointed, because that's part of life too, and that's part of war too. To work really hard and then have victory snatched away from you, and that's tough, because I understand that on a certain level, the nature of a game is you want to have that guaranteed success you can't have in real life. That promise, like if you work hard enough, you'll get the good ending, you know. But you know, for games to be art, there needs to be diversity in what
We'll
games
get to
do.
that at the end, but
yeah.
religion, hot, spicy religion.
Yeah.
We'll start with a great chance to, not that the game is unheralded, but Vagrant Story. And I've always wanted to put, of the many great things that Alexander O. Smith did in the translation, I think this is a good way to start it, and especially because we've been talking and talking. Let's have a little visual stimulus now. And even though there is no voices in this clip, I might be wrong, but I also think it would be awesome for, like, Lapreter to voice the girl character from, darn, what is that? Dragon Ball Z Abridged, and John Bailey to voice Guildenstern, the man. It might have been awful, but I think it would work at the same time. And Sydney, I have no idea, but this dialogue, it almost got me in trouble one time. I love the font. Everything about this game is awesome. There's a reason it got 10 out of 10 from Famitsu. It's one of the I love that line. And that's absolutely true. I mean, when you think of Guildenstern, you think maybe of the character from Romeo and Juliet, but it's not Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet. Sorry. But it's not only a brilliant game. I'm not sure if it would be enhanced by having voices, but it's the kind of game that they were absolutely right to give a perfect review to. And Alexander O. Smith, the translator, just really had some fun with it, making some sort of archaic English into it. But the way it handles religious themes, that a person once emailed me saying, oh, that's offensive, that quote. You know, this was back in like early 2000s. So briefly, I did put Sidney Losterot, his name, on the corruption of the St. Iocus Church. I wasn't referring to the church in general, but it seems to be a fun little thing, especially because this is meant to be a medieval world. Specifically, the place in Vagrant Story is modeled on the Bordeaux region of France and the politics of the time that led it to be. It's just an interesting little thing. And as I say, I kind of tried to have a little fun with that. Religion as a word simply means someone like who's really devoted to something. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Get really down to the dirt nitty-gritty about what religion is, and we kind of tried to do it there. And the contrast with that was minimalism. I think that was the next thing, yeah. What minimalism needs to do, not so much the artistic movement, but what came very close to me when I was playing the Souls series, specifically Demon Souls. Familiar with it, everybody? Apparently. There is a character in the first game, not that the second and third game, Dark Souls, don't have elements that are plot-wise like that, but I found the best part of it was when, when Saint Urbain, you know, he's always going on and on about Frake and the witch and how they'll be damned forever because they use the power of the Old One, which is the masterful demon Cthulhu-type tree being in Demon Souls. And at the end, when it becomes, he hears like, before you go to face it, sort of, it sounds like the cry of a child, and he has basically a crisis of faith, and he starts to, almost like his sins are laid bare, because especially if you've gotten the Talisman of Beasts, which allows you to cast both miracles and spells in that game, it turns out that the power of faith in that game and the power of evil comes all from the Old One. So it's meant to be, it doesn't seem like an accident as an overall commentary on the nature of, as opposed like when we moved away from like Greek mythology and stuff, from multiple gods to like monotheistic religions. And Mass Effect, Demon Souls, they don't really make a comment on that. They just show it and they leave it up to the players to interpret. And I thought that's perfectly, especially as a contrast to that clip we just saw, which is making it very clear what it thinks. It leaves it up to the player. And I don't think Demon Souls and maybe Dark Souls gets enough credit for being able to do that when the emphasis is on the gameplay. Thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, this is actually a topic near and dear to my heart because I was raised in a pretty hardcore evangelical Christian household, and I was also really hardcore into science fiction and fantasy. And this is kind of the funny thing, is that J.R.R. Tolkien was a very devout Christian, and the modern kind of fantasy that we have, where it's not just like I wrote a story in a fantasy world, but I came up with the world, and I came up with the languages and the map, and like he started that trend, and he did that as part of his religious faith. He called it subcreation, that part of loving God's creation is, trying to get into the mindset of God and what it would be like to like imagine a world, a whole world. And I almost feel like, see, religion in real life means having that imaginative capacity to imagine beyond the real world, like, look at the world, look at a tree and imagine the spirit of the tree, right? Look at the sky and imagine the sky being put together by gods in ancient times. And yet, religion in the world now is threatened by imagination because, and this is my personal story, but the more you can imagine, the more you can think about the implications of your faith, the more you can think about other faiths possibly being true, and the more you can think about the possibility that yours is wrong. And for me, being a geek and having that freedom to imagine a world where there's a different God, or there's multiple gods, or that the history of the world is different and that God is a computer or a simulation, right? That freedom was eventually what got me to, eventually drift away from my childhood faith. And so it ends up being that thing, like Tolkien saw fantasy as an expression of religion, and a lot of other people see fantasy as a threat to religion. And I almost feel like it's not that the Christians who were against Harry Potter really believed that Harry Potter was written by the devil or that you could learn to do magic spells, but it's that they felt
control ending.
Right. But if you feel threatened by the ability to challenge stories or to make up different stories, that you're going to see science fiction and fantasy as a threat, as genre fiction as a threat. And for me, that's always been sort of like a tug of war, a push and pull for me. And that's the thing. J.K. Rowling identifies as a Christian. She's a Calvinist, and that actually does inform a lot of her writing. I don't see real-life religion and science fiction and fantasy as at odds, but I do think there's a tension there. And you hear about that because you hear about interesting things like countries in the Middle East that are, theocratic, that in Iran they have arguments over whether or not a specific work of science fiction or fantasy is heretical, right? Does it show God, or does it show an avatar of God? If the avatar of God is it implied the avatar is human, or is it implied, like that kind of thing? There was literally an argument over whether Morgan Freeman in Bruce Almighty was blasphemous to Islam or not, depending on whether or not you interpret him as being God himself or as God taking a form to speak to Jim Carrey, or, and this is a theological argument they're having about a very silly movie, right? But it's a serious thing for some people. And so this is a thing that I think a lot about, especially because we geeks, including I think it's fair to say the mainstream geek movement is pretty skeptical, pretty dominated by atheism, agnosticism, that we start to develop the same patterns, that we actually use the word canon to talk about the imaginary worlds that we're interested in, and we actually police what's heretical and what's not. Is this a thing that would make sense in Star Wars or not? People get mad when you write a fanfic that violates how they think that world works. And that's just like it's a human way that we deal with imagining things, is that we imagine things and then we think of those things as true, and then we try to make sure that the thing that we imagined displaces other people's imaginations. It's a fascinating, very, very messy topic, but I'm very interested in it.
To drive that point home, true, agnostic, but at the same time, as a professor said to me once, the Bible is generally considered to be a very accurate, quotations, source of ancient history. When, especially the book Judges, it talks a lot about the Philistines, and it's pretty darn good for that. But again, hence the joke I'm attempting to go to, the problem with religion is when people get too religious about it. They take it too seriously and stuff like that. And morality, like as Arthur C. Clarke once said, one of the greatest crimes in, I forgot the whole quote, but it's the hijacking of morality by religion, the idea that you can't be moral if you're not a religious person. And I think that's what Saint Urbain ultimately, like, because of how judgmental he is, like, ultimately is a way to reconcile, like, his faith. Like, I don't think he's questioning himself in the game. You don't really get a lot of characterization, but he's almost worried that he could be wrong. Soul's biggest strength may ultimately be in its presentation over the gameplay polish, but it's those elements that the difficulty of discussing it in a meaningful way without being judgmental, I think Souls does it really well, and certainly popular enough, even though I don't think it compares. Dark Souls is certainly way more popular, but I think enough people have gone back at least and played Demon Souls to hopefully pick up on that. And also, the word heresy. That word doesn't mean much. It's like a boo word, but it essentially just means you don't agree with some church doctrine. Woo! Big whoop-de-doo. So what? you know?
Well.
It's but I'm being pedantic there, but literally that's what the word means. So you can give it power, just like they're trying to do with racial slurs and various things like that. But it's ultimately up to us. So I don't think it's really that different. As George Carlin said, rip, similarities over differences. Look it up. It's a great little routine he did called Little Things We Share. And to the point where it's not about just creating conflict, but people will ultimately try and take advantage of the conflicts it created to push their own agenda or become wealthy or other things. Let's see. We are able to go until 3:50 if we need to, so I'm hoping we can keep going around if you're interested in that, because I do have a little bit more, gameplay. I would like to hear topic suggestions from you or anything. Raise hands, please. Uh-oh.
Yeah,
oh, sure. Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with that, Oliver.
Nor am I. I haven't played. Initially I was like, everyone hates Final Fantasy 13. Okay, that means I gotta give it a chance. Big supporter of Unlimited Saga here. That was, especially because it came out after Final Fantasy 10, everyone shit on it because they don't know anything about the Saga series, or Akitoshi Kawazu, yet he's still with Square, so they think he must thinking he's doing something right. So I tried to give 13 a fair shake, and I was kind of in between jobs then, and then they make 13 too, and then they make Lightning, and now 14 early beta, now 15, it's just like, I'll get it through it eventually, but I fortunately don't know much.
Well, can you give us a
please.
rundown of how you see the situation? Okay.
Yes, I think I remember hearing something about that, especially the character design. Yeah. No, it's not. That's petulance again, especially because, the joke they like to go with Kawazu, Final Fantasy 1 and 2, both very different games functionally, that were his. He wasn't the director, but he designed the gameplay before, like, Tetsu Nomura emerged and various other, Kazushika Nojima and various other ones. And then the joke gets to go, like, they gave him not so much as, like, Gunpei Yokoi after the Virtual Boy, but he was like, oh, go off and have fun with Saga. Because every game in the Saga series, 13 games with a new one coming out soon, plays completely differently. That's what he cares more about. And I wish fans were more familiar with the Saga series, because he's not the overlord of it. I mean, there are other people he ultimately gets to decide, but everyone is different because he believes, in the gameplay experience. And sometimes the storyline suffers as a comparison, but in terms of visual presentation, it's all very fascinating. That's what I look forward to, that it's going to be something different. And I think that's what people should do with 15, especially when it comes to the point where you're going to tell people what you want. Well, I know what they're going to do. You're going to want Final Fantasy VII system. And that's why I kind of laughed at it with Dirge of Cerberus, even though that wasn't a very good game. But I openly hope that they would have done some kind of Saga-type system just to fuck with people. Like, you love 7, well, you know what I mean? And I know they're changing it for the remake of 7, but again, mass appeal again. They're going to have to keep it relatively familiar, because I don't know if it's a lack of imagination or anything, but Square has always been somewhat, in divisions like that, and they need to get back to remembering that they were like that. Because, you don't get to 13 games, possibly more in the Saga series without, I think Imperial Saga, or maybe they changed the name, is going to be the 14th one. It has its fans. So, run the counterpoint. Good,
Oh yeah. Right. I mean, I hear that, and I'm a huge community fan, and I follow Dan Harmon on Twitter. And the thing is, with him in particular, you can see that there's a push and pull there because he is very open to the fans, and he has apologized full scale for stuff where he felt like I did something wrong and the fans were right to be pissed. But at the same time, he gets so involved in arguments with fans, and he's had meltdowns because of arguments with fans, and he has had fans sort of like go after him. Like, you see this happen, right? I'm not saying it's a bad thing to listen to your fans. Ultimately, you are making something for an audience, right? You have to be, you have to, on some level, be thinking about your audience and people who have this image of the genius creator in the tower who never looks at their audience. That's usually false. But I do feel like there's a line, even when I agree with the criticisms, like, I'm a big Dan Harmon fan. I think he screwed up a lot of things, but I think the show was not the same without him. And I think that without him, the two guys that got to replace him, Goroshini and Port, weren't bad, but they very clearly, and Dan Harmon said this, they very clearly just looked at what do community fans want. Well, let's just do that for Community Season 4. And community fans hated Community Season 4 because you could predict everything they were going to do. Oh, here's an episode about this. Here's an episode about that. We've been teasing Jeff meeting his dad. Here's an episode about Jeff meeting his dad. That's exactly what you would expect from an episode about Jeff meeting his dad, is that ultimately we are after creators to give us something that we can't come up with ourselves. That's their job. That's why they're doing it and we're not doing it, because we're after them to surprise us or challenge us. And so there needs to be feedback, there needs to be communication, but there also needs to be a little bit of a separation. And I see a lot of people quitting Twitter, specifically because Twitter is a very easy way for someone to say, I hated this, and then just keep on saying, I hated it.
Twitter's still popular? It's been around for like 5 years. It shouldn't be anymore.
Right,
I know the rules.
Right, but it's not that's not necessarily the kind
I
of
didn't make the rules.
Helpful feedback. I think helpful feedback is like, if I tried to say something and it came off the wrong way and you interpret it meaning something very different, then that means I failed, and I want to know that I failed. But if I try to do something, you're just saying, and you're telling me that's not what I wanted you to do, at some point I have to say, well, I'm not necessarily doing it for you then. I might be doing it for this person over there or this person over there,
I guess it's ultimately how you couch your argument, and maybe because especially the fact that we refer to video game generations as 4 or 5 years, maybe it encourages a very rapid, better than schizophrenic word. I always have trouble with that, lack of nuance type delivery, and it could be an implicit thing. It's not necessarily our fans, like the twirling mustache analogy. Like, how can I go out and screw with people or something like that?
And part of it is that sometimes the people who are loudest don't really represent the majority, or they believe they're the only point of view out there, and they're
that's encouraged by like Crossfire and Network News.
Reductio ad absurdum is, if they had fan feedback for Final Fantasy VII, they would have put in a patch where you could save Eris. Right? If they had immediate fan feedback, that's what they would have done. Yeah, but that would have been terrible, right? But anyway, I hope it's not an answer to your question per se, but that's my point of view on it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. They never seem to consider that part. Just automatically, whatever they wanted would be better. Dilution,
I kind of feel like, we've got other people.
He was, I think so.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Over here first, in front. Then you. Yep. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I don't.
Conflation is a real problem. Things that have nothing to do with each other, and I don't know if that's what people. But history teaches us that oftentimes things have very boring answers. So I try and apply to that. Like again, it's not the twirling mustache. There might be people like as the Joker said who want to see the world burn, but most of the time they're waxing that at best. They're waxing chaotic. If we can do a portmanteau with that, and I think we should.
I
But
I almost feel
I
like
don't know. The world is a system, and
I almost I almost feel like this is like walking into a trap because I'm not saying you're, but I mean I feel like a certain part of the internet's really heated up about something that's really not. It's just tempest in a teapot. It's like one game, Fire Emblem Fates, that they're mad about now,
Yeah.
and that
Oh, they are.
yeah. Okay, okay,
Oh, yeah.
okay. I
Um,
think I think yeah.
I remembered the Good Family Guy line. The episode where Joe, like Quagmire, he can't fly a plane anymore because Peter screws up. They make it more exciting by adding fires and bunnies and stuff to it. And then he goes quickly, and then we got to throw in a man to get the human tragedy. And he comes out and he goes home and savagely beats his wife. So then they go, I'm alive, but boy, am I angry. Someone's got to pay for this. It's like, I don't know if that's their version of like how they feel alive or something like that, but it gets tough.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, that kind of thing's been going on a long time, and it really, people are just kind of like discovering it now or getting mad about it now. But it's been historically, and it's not just Japan versus the United States. It's that they've changed costumes for sensibilities in the EU. They've they've for the Chinese market, there's stuff that gets specifically censored for that market because of that's just part of yeah, you can't display skeletons, so instead you have like emaciated, fleshy corpses, which are scarier. But
I shouldn't say this, but I know what's going to happen now because I haven't played the King of Fighters games in a while. But do they still allow Billy Kane to wear the Union Jack as a hat, or did they take that away? Or does he wear the Union Jack or something very similar? They did. Crap. Okay, that is a little weird, but maybe what? Oh, okay. So
I just get weirded out because you can argue about whether a decision's a good decision or a bad decision artistically, but localization's an important thing, and people are acting like I've seen people saying like, no, it should just be a straight translation, right? Which is where you get the like really crappy like fan subs for anime where you have to like read 10 footnotes to get what he's talking about.
and the hate for Ted Woolsey, which I don't think is fair. If you remember Ted
Right,
Woolsey.
like what we love about Chrono Trigger is the stuff that he put in that he yeah. Yeah.
Regional differences, again, it's you can easily conflate that to a larger agenda, but oftentimes it is. Even back then, they had to make business decisions. Like I believe Final Fantasy VI, and it's a curious piece of magazine information put in. Like print space at a premium. Even back then, they said like the translators are hard at work. Like 2 months before it came out, translating the roughly 90,000 pages of text. It's like, why are you telling us this? It's so really fascinating, but I guess they just want us to remember that take your time or something. You know. Absolutely. But that's something that I remember very clearly. Actually, I think there was a person in the back there first. Sorry.
All right. Don't get me wrong about this. I don't think it's wrong to say things are bad. I write scathing reviews all the time, and I say, like, I come out of a movie and say that movie was shit, you know. And even if it was the creator's original vision, I have the right to say it was a shitty vision. That's your right as a fan, as a customer, as just a person with freedom of speech. You have the right to say you didn't like something. What I was objecting to was stuff like when you put together a petition or you go to the FTC and you like start to say, like, I demand the right that you edit this. You know, that's at the very least, I'm not even gonna say that's a wrong thing to do. I think that's counterproductive because it's not gonna be what you wanted to anyway, because he's not doing it from a place of I actually see the, you know, if someone is like doing something just to like get the heat off of them, it's not gonna be done well. It's not gonna be executed well.
When it comes to art, you trivialize it because I'm sure before Jackson Pollock became popular, more so than anything, that analogy of like, oh, my 6-year-old kid could do that, which isn't disrespectful to him, but to art and everything else, you know, but, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely agree a lot of times. It's a valid criticism to, I look at something and I say, this is soulless, this is just, you know, pandering. This is not what the creator wanted. At the same time, it is what the creator wanted, isn't an infallible defense. Creators are fallible, and in fact, tons of really cool stuff wouldn't exist if all art died with its original creator. I'm not saying the best place to put that art is in the hands of a profit-making corporation, but a lot of times really cool stuff comes out of that. All the comics that I've liked in the past 20 years, they're from stuff that was created like 50, 60 years ago, and then they hired someone else to work on it. And it's really, oftentimes those are fans. You know, I like fan fiction. That's just paid fan fiction. Is people taking an idea and making it their own. It can be good or it can be bad. I try to take it on its own merits. You know, so
fan fiction confuses me, but I'm not going to tell people they can't write it. Right. You know.
Right, but yeah, I don't want to like elevate the auteur theory. The original creator must be right because it was his vision. You know, art is always collaborative, especially in games. Is that you have an original writer, but you have a team that adds to it. In fact, one of the things about the Mass Effect 3 ending was, unlike all the other parts of the game, they kicked everyone else out of the writer's room, and then one guy wrote the ending. And it's like that's part of why it doesn't feel satisfying, because it drops all these threads that were part of the original story. Yeah, go ahead. Right. It's kind of unfair, but it's the George Lucas argument. George Lucas is a good guy. I don't want to brag on him.
But to get into about original creators, reviewers, we all think we know better. I thought the two counterpoints are mostly from an analytical point of view. Yahtzee says this, especially in our
these days. Since the internet is almost diametrically opposed to the notion of quality control, in recent years it's been a lot easier to just assume everything's shit until it can prove itself otherwise. I like to call it the Guantanamo Bay approach to reviewing, but as for why I review stuff by popular demand regardless of personal feeling, it's partly because it feels more professional than constant self-indulgence, but mostly because I use my traffic figures to measure my worth as a human being. I like the idea of a professional troll, though. It makes me think of a hideous creature under a bridge handing out business cards. This review here, from a purely objective standpoint, SSBB is actually quite a superb game, as you can tell by reading reviews. I think you should look up the word objective, because I don't think it means what you think it means. It's worth remembering that all reviews are subjective personal opinions, and if you personally enjoy the game, then they really shouldn't get to you. Unless, of course, there's a despicable little niggling doubt in the back of your mind that maybe you're not having as much fun as you've convinced yourself you're having, which doesn't go away no matter how many times you try to slap it down with the wet flannel of weak excuses like this one. I'm not a fan.
Like Vagrant Story. I tried to tell you about it. You all go off and you don't like it. It's like, oh crap, I've ruined it for you, but maybe it's something in your head, you know, like just because everyone says it's awesome doesn't mean you have to find it awesome. And to run the point home again about Unlimited Saga, as he said about popularity. Here's someone popular saying essentially the same thing. Woohoo! No, that goes on more, but you got to edit it.
This was, yeah.
Here's a popular person saying essentially, it's your imagination, what you want to see in a game.
It's getting pretty late. How come you're still up?
I found an emulator online that lets you play classic text-based computer games from the 1980s.
That's pretty cool.
Oh,
That's
yes.
me, by
It
the
runs
way.
on the world's most powerful graphics chip, imagination.
Text Adventures.
You've really got to get
Kawasu
out
had
more.
his way. I think put a graphics engine in the game.
Go north. You can't go that way. Go west. A troll blocks your passage. Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Kill troll. With what? With sword. You don't have the sword. Good golly, it's as if it's actually happening to me.
In a computer game and
Hit troll with axe. Hit troll with axe. Hit troll with axe.
I don't say it out loud, but this is me.
And that's what he's such a say. You know, like, it's just a bunch of words on paper, but it's what you want to get from it, and that's not even considering his personality or anything like that. But, you know, these guys all say the game's a 10. You know, what if you don't think it is, you know, and things like that.
Like,
If you personally enjoy it, like Yahtzee said, you know, like, not to the point where you should argue about it, but you can in the back of your head and try your best to mention it to other people. But I'm not going to say, you must all go play Unlimited Saga now, and you must all love it, you know?
yeah, I have
Or
mixed.
you're all banned from MAGFest forever. That would, to take it to the nth degree.
I have mixed feelings about Yahtzee, but when he came out, it was like a huge breath of fresh air, and it wasn't just the cursing or the lack of
Absolutely not, yeah.
or the lack of review scores. It was the way it was just like the unapologetic. This is what I like. This is what I don't like. And for so long, game reviews have tried to avoid pissing people off by trying to figure out what the right perspective is. Right, I'm going to pretend to be the ideal fan for this game and then review it on those merits. And when he just comes out and says, "I don't give a shit about multiplayer,"
Yeah,
I am part of
too.
the part of the population that does not give a shit about multiplayer. And so every time I play a game and the campaign is terrible, and they tell me, "But it's great on multiplayer," it's like I don't have time to develop another interest in a multiplayer community, you know. And it's like I know that I am very different from a different demographic, but I'm here too, right? And for Yahtzee to like come out and say, you know, I'm going to review this based on what I want, and at the very least to like hit back against the people who say, oh, you have to have a campaign in the game, but it's not actually important. Then why'd you make it at all, right?
Yeah.
But,
You want a review score? How about a 4, as in fork you? He
Right.
says. Oh, good stuff. You know. Still, but I
Yeah.
did have one more thing about God of War in the context of religion. That's more, you know, about awareness of history. Would you like to hear that? Okay. God of War, enjoyed it, but all, you know, like, and that one was a little bit more unlike Mass Effect, waited for each new one to come out. But one thing as I came to it, especially being a fan of Greek mythology, there's nothing like a Christian ethos to way of doing things to sully the often capricious nature of Greek gods. You know, like, they'll fuck with people because they feel like it. The gods were basically jerks in Greek mythology, which was one of Socrates' main criticisms, but it was necessary to make it as overt as possible, because the conundrum and the mess they get into with Kratos, and frankly the myopic writers, because they don't want to know about this stuff. You know, they know what they got to do, even though Greek mythology was not a new presence in games. They were focusing more on the gameplay, and the storyline was second. And it was never more proof than what they did with Pandora's Box in the original game. It's a jar that holds the evils of the world. It's not Lord Zed's magical growing grenades from Power Rangers. At least they try in God of War 3 to fix it as a way to both explain their take on Greek mythology and and just, again, the Futurama joke. Just because you're giant doesn't mean, you know, like, you can't fight something equally giant, you know? And I know they try and do it, but they try and make the anti-hero Kratos more sympathetic, which is not an easy task. Like, to go back to Lewis Black, if you're going to get someone and they're an asshole, you don't make someone a bigger asshole, because then the asshole just makes the other asshole look like, and it's a great little routine, because Kratos is an asshole. And he tries, but ultimately nothing can forgive the depiction of Hades, especially in the first game, as both a place and as a god. Kratos doesn't think much of being there, obviously, because he's apparently just able to walk out numerous times throughout the whole series, and neither should fans of Greek mythology. Hades was said to be the most striking, beautiful of all the gods, not Satan, the Greek edition. I tell you, if he wasn't voiced by Mr. Krabs, I would probably write letters to them. Clancy Brown in the third game, who's also the Kurgan, and I don't know what the heck they were doing there, because, you know, again, the internet was already huge, obviously, But like, did they hope no one would look it up?
I disagree about that
Doesn't bug you?
I'm a fan of the God of War series, and they're very much aware they're not telling the original Greek myths. They're speaking to a pop culture depiction. It's even they have Kevin Sorbo play Hercules, right?
But they
have
make references to the myth with him.
Well, yeah,
so
yeah.
Make fun of it.
Yeah, but they have the Perseus from Clash of the Titans. Like, it's actually him. It's
Thanatos was actually more accurate than Hades.
well, yeah, but
So
I one thing that I liked about it was that getting that feeling of the Greek myths, especially as they would have been perceived by someone at the time, as opposed to us reading about it as mythology.
Yeah.
That the cool thing about the Greek myths was this idea that anything could happen, because these were just stories people made up back then. That some of them became canon and some of them didn't.
Hades,
but
I really do think they looked at him from a Satan perspective, you know.
they made him look like Satan, but he's not the Satan of the story. Zeus is the Satan of the story.
That's true.
That's kind of the...
That's the asshole thing I was trying to get into. They
Yeah.
essentially make Zeus into an asshole, you know.
Zeus is an asshole.
Yeah. Well,
He
yeah,
is.
he was in the myths too. It's true.
But,
with very few exceptions, but even more so.
But,
like-
I mean, the closest thing to Kratos is Hercules, basically. And the cool thing about the Hercules stories that later became myths is that there's stories about how Hercules gets pissed off, and then anything can happen.
True.
He can break any of the rules of the world because he's so angry. And that's why he's so compelling as a story. So, and they go further than the original myths because they have to in order to surprise you, the real-life person who already knows the Greek myths. So it's stuff like the part where Kratos breaks the pillar holding up the world, and he's the reason Atlas has to hold up the world. You know, Kratos
was
kills
good,
the fates. Kratos, but you know, the original myths, Kratos, Hercules goes and breaks into hell, into Hades, wrestles Hades, and then beats him in a wrestling match and brings back his friend's wife. That's ridiculous. From a religious point of view, that's blasphemous. But the reason that Hercules was a compelling character to the ancient Greeks is it's a story about a guy breaking the rules, and we're very excited by those kinds of stories.
It works.
In the modern world, it's like Superman being able to fly around the world and go back in time. He's just so awesome, he can break the rules. In the Monkey King in Chinese mythology, right? The reason we love Sun Wukong is because he was written as a guy who can trick the gods, right? The gods were conceived of as a vast bureaucracy, as a set of laws that govern the world, and he tricked them. He screwed them up. He stole his own the date of his own death and erased it and made himself immortal. That's a compelling story. It's in religion. Religion is partly about the rules about the way the world works, and then it's about stories about the ways you can break those rules, right?
There is some nuance in it, though. After all, Theseus more in God of War, he's kind of, they add some interesting elements. But how did he kill the Minotaur in the myth? Subterfuge, secrecy. Perseus, same thing. So maybe that's why Greek mythology endures. It is all over the place. But if there is one thing I'd like you to take away from this, because I'm going to have to start wrapping up, I thought this is more from Unbreakable, but I thought it worked really well in the context. Just pretend he's talking about video games, and I really like to see someone do this instead of comic books. Preferably Samuel L. Jackson. That would be awesome.
Once again, please.
My son Jeb, it's a gift for him.
Oh, there you go.
How old is Jeb?
He's 4.
Can you put it a little louder?
No.
Master.
You need to go. Now.
What'd I say?
Do you see any Teletubbies in here?
Yeah.
Do you see a slender plastic tag clipped to my shirt with my name printed on it? Did you see a little Asian child with a blank expression sitting outside in a mechanical helicopter that shakes when you put quarters in it? No? Well, that's what you see at a toy store. And you must think you're in a toy store because you're here shopping for an infant named Jeb.
Parents buying video games.
And one of us has made a gross error and wasted the other person's valuable time. This is an art gallery, my friend. And this is a piece of art.
Right there. The argument, should make a PSA or something, Samuel L. Jackson. But there are
course
people who still believe that.
He does go on to murder people, so it's not.
I
he's
like
not
the
a
line,
role
not the
model.
character.
Yeah.
Like I said, I wish we would realize that about video games. And then one other message just to take away, kind of like going with the Yahtzee thing. He doesn't just curse. I always enjoy this one, especially to mess with sports fans. I like sports too, so I think that's allowed.
Maybe you're the kind of person who remembers which bush to burn in The Legend of Zelda to find the labyrinth, or maybe you're the kind of person who remembers the score to some sports game years ago. Maybe you like to go around in a Star Trek uniform, or you like to go around in a sports uniform. And I don't mean like a sports t-shirt, but the same jersey that the players in the game wear. Whatever the case, maybe, somehow, in our own ways, we're all nerds.
There were quite a lot of cosplayers at the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Not my joke, but I've always enjoyed that one. And yeah, we have like 2 or 3 more minutes. Any questions? Anything else you want to say? I just wanted to get through that little bit. Anything else? If so, if not, I hope. Oh, yes.
Oh, you mean like non-human characters in games, or? I think the Geth are one of the most compelling attempts to do a story about an AI species or an AI people in video games. Because we were talking about Mass Effect before. Because, and actually, in contrast to Edie, who's a fine character, but we've seen that before. The AI who's like kind of a smartass and wants to be a person, and it's kind of disturbing. But the Geth are actually really interesting because they really did double down on this idea of like, what if there was a race of intelligent beings that didn't think like people, where their instinct was always to consensus, where they didn't have a sense of individuality, which we normally think of as a very scary thing, right? A hive mind means bad guys, usually. But the Geth, I felt were very, I thought it was very compelling. They were in some senses better people than the Quarians, right? They decided they could have killed all the Quarians, but they had no sense of revenge. They were only seeking to survive, and so they let them go. You know, at every point, the decisions the Geth make are all like just based on a very like, this is for the greater good, and they really make you the feeling of being alien but not evil. You know,
Revenge
and that was
is always problematic. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter, you know, even if they try and couch it in logic. But they sure came to that realization that it was, you know, like they let them escape and stuff like that, either
Right.
because it was an analytical decision or because they, you know, they refer to them as the creators, kind of like a silent tribute.
The
even though it
hardest
might be
thing-
undeserved.
Yeah, the hardest thing to do is to write a non-human character, because you are a human, right? And so it ends up being dressing it up in one way or another. A very angry human, a very, you know, a very happy human, a very sexy human, right? That's like the 3 characters in Mass Effect. No, but a lot of times it is about like, if you want to explore what it would be like to be non-human, then you think about things that we just don't do, but it's weird that we don't do them, you know? And I feel like for the Geth, a lot of it was like, let's really think about logical things the human race could do that we just can't seem to do, like not fighting with each other, right? Like coming to consensus, like letting past offenses go because taking vengeance for them has no current rational benefit.
Absolutely.
That's something you really can't actually imagine people doing or not doing without great struggle. And so if you try to imagine something like that and what it would be like to be someone who was like that, they would be inhuman but in some ways better than us. And I think that's a very interesting, you know, but yeah, it's the hardest thing to do, so I try to go easy on people. You know, even though I'm still mad that the Asari are basically like sexy blue space women, right? But they did. I do like, you know, going into stuff like what would it be like to live for hundreds of years and have people that you know live a very short time compared to you, that kind of thing. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do. That's one example. Do you have any?
We're pretty much, you know, we've done the
Okay.
lifetime, but if you're interested, come by again next year and we'll do it again. Maybe I don't know what's on my schedule. I'm always trying to come up with new stuff, but as you can see from the content, that was only about 10 or actual 15 minutes, so I know we didn't get to everybody, but thank you for the questions, and I hope you enjoyed it. And with that, we have to get going.
Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
out, guys.